The unexpected decision. Dr. Nathaniel Harris was known in the small town of Brookshire for two things: his surgical precision and his unwavering dedication to his patients. A respected surgeon at Brookshire General Hospital, Nathaniel had spent years honing his skills, saving lives, and earning the admiration of his peers. His life, however, had become a carefully orchestrated routine. Long hours at the hospital, quiet dinners in his empty home, and weekends spent catching up on sleep. There was a void, a quiet, unspoken loneliness that had crept into his heart. But Nathaniel had long convinced himself that his demanding career was enough to fill that gap. It was on one of those routine nights, after a particularly grueling 14-hour shift, that Nathaniel's life took an unexpected turn. The hospital corridors were quiet as he walked out into the cool night air, his breath visible in the crisp autumn breeze. As he fumbled for his keys, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, whimpering cry, almost imperceptible against the rustling of the wind. He paused, the sound tugging at something deep within him. Curiosity piqued. Nathaniel followed the sound, his footsteps slowing as he neared the emergency entrance of the hospital. There, tucked away near the shadows of the building, was a small bundle. His heart skipped a beat as he bent down, carefully pulling back the edge of a tattered blanket. His breath caught in his throat. It was a baby, a tiny infant with soft brown skin and a head full of curly black hair, its small fists clenched as it cried softly into the night. Nathaniel's first instinct was to call for help, to alert the hospital staff. But as he lifted the baby gently into his arms, something shifted within him. The baby's cries quieted, and for a moment their eyes met. Dark, soulful eyes that seemed to reach into his very core. In that instant, Nathaniel felt an inexplicable connection, a sense of responsibility and purpose that he had never felt before. He cradled the baby close, his mind racing with questions. Who could have abandoned this innocent child? And why here? At a hospital. As he turned to rush back inside, the answer to the second question became all too clear. No one had left the baby by accident. They had left it with the hope that someone, perhaps someone like him, would find it. Inside the hospital, the staff quickly sprang into action. The baby, a boy, was examined, his vitals checked, and the necessary authorities were notified. Nathaniel watched from the hallway, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of the baby's eyes, the way they had looked at him with such vulnerability, as if silently pleading for protection. Several hours passed before a social worker arrived. Nathaniel had barely moved from his spot, unable to tear himself away from the situation. The social worker, a kind-looking woman in her early 40s, approached him with a clipboard in hand. "Dr. Harris," she began, "I understand you found the child." Nathaniel nodded. Yes, outside the emergency entrance. He was just there, alone. The social worker sighed, her expression a mixture of concern and weariness. "Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. No one has come forward to claim him, and it's unlikely they will. He'll be placed in the foster care system if no one steps up." Nathaniel felt a tightening in his chest at her words. The thought of this child, this tiny, defenseless baby, being shuffled from home to home, never knowing stability, gnawed at him. He had seen too many children lost in the system, their lives forever altered by a lack of permanence and love. Without thinking, Nathaniel spoke. "I'll take him." The social worker blinked, clearly taken aback. "Dr. Harris, are you sure? This is a big decision. You're a single man with a demanding career. Adopting a child, especially one of a different race, it won't be easy." Nathaniel's gaze never wavered from the baby, now sleeping peacefully in a hospital crib. "I know," he said quietly, but with conviction. "But he needs someone. And I have the means, the time, and the love to give. I want to adopt him." The words hung in the air between them, solid and irreversible. The social worker studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, Dr. Harris, if you're certain, we can start the paperwork. But I want you to think carefully about this. A child of color, especially in a town like Brookshire, it's going to be a challenge. People will talk. They may not be kind. I've never been one to care about what people say, Nathaniel replied, his voice firm. This boy deserves a home, and I'm going to give it to him. As the social worker made the necessary arrangements, Nathaniel stayed by the baby's side, gently stroking his tiny hand. I'll name you David, he whispered, David Harris. And I promise, I'll always be here for you. Nathaniel took David home the next day, his heart full of hope and a newfound sense of purpose. The quiet, empty house that had once seemed so vast now felt warm and alive with the presence of this small new life. As he settled David into his new crib, Nathaniel couldn't help but smile. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He had made the right choice. But Brookshire was not a town known for its open-mindedness. The news of Dr. Nathaniel Harris, the highly respected surgeon, adopting a black child spread through the town like wildfire. And soon, the whispers and judgment began. It started subtly, hushed conversations at the grocery store, sideways glances at the diner. People who had once greeted Nathaniel with warm smiles now averted their eyes. It was as if his decision to adopt David had altered their perception of him, of who he was and what he stood for. The first overt sign of disapproval came from his own family. It was a Sunday afternoon when Nathaniel's parents invited him over for dinner. His father, Robert Harris, was a retired businessman, a man of few words but strong opinions. His mother, Anne, had always been the nurturing type, though she, too, held traditional values. Nathaniel knew the conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Seated at the dinner table, the tension was palpable. The clinking of silverware against plates was the only sound that filled the room, until Robert cleared his throat. Nathaniel, he began, his voice heavy with concern, we need to talk about this decision of yours. Nathaniel set down his fork, his stomach tightening. If you're talking about David, then say his name. He's not just a decision, Dad. He's my son. Anne reached out, placing a hand on Nathaniel's. Honey, we're just worried. Raising a child is hard enough, but a black child, in Brookshire, people are already talking. Nathaniel's sister, Caroline, chimed in, her brow furrowed with concern. And what about your career, Nathaniel? You're always at the hospital. How are you going to balance work and being a single father? Nathaniel felt his frustration rise, but he kept his voice steady. I'll make it work, Caroline. David needs me, and I'm not going to let him down. This isn't about what's easy. It's about doing what's right. Robert shook his head, his expression stern. Son, this town isn't ready for this. People are going to treat you differently. They're going to treat him differently. So what if they do? Nathaniel's voice rose slightly, his conviction unwavering. David deserves love, and I'm going to give him that. I don't care what anyone else thinks. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken doubts and fears. But Nathaniel had made his choice, and nothing would change his mind. David was his son, and he would protect him, no matter the cost. As Nathaniel left his parents' house that evening, his mind was filled with uncertainty about the challenges that lay ahead. But as he looked at David, sleeping peacefully in his car seat, he knew one thing for sure. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. In the days that followed, the disapproval from the town grew more apparent. People whispered behind his back, some even openly questioning his judgment. But Nathaniel held his head high, determined to give David the love and stability he deserved. What Nathaniel didn't know was that this decision, the decision to adopt David, would one day come full circle in the most unexpected and profound way. Those who judged him now would soon find themselves in a position they could never have imagined, and Nathaniel would be the one they turned to for help. But for now, as he cradled his son in his arms, he focused only on the love that had brought them together, and the future they would build, no matter what challenges lay ahead. And so, the journey began. The growing storm. As months turned into years, Nathaniel Harris's life transformed in ways he never could have predicted. Fatherhood brought a joy he had never known, but it also came with a weight of responsibility and a host of challenges that seemed to grow by the day. David blossomed into a curious, bright-eyed toddler, filling the once quiet house with laughter and Nathaniel's heart with pride. Yet outside the walls of their home, life in Brookshire grew increasingly complicated. The small, tightly knit town, one that had always prided itself on its traditional values, became an unwelcome, judgmental place for Nathaniel and his adopted son. From the moment he had brought David into his life, Nathaniel had braced himself for resistance, but nothing could have prepared him for the coldness that slowly crept into his interactions with the people he had once called friends and colleagues. What had begun as hushed whispers and sidelong glances soon evolved into overt judgment and outright hostility. One afternoon, about 2 years after adopting David, Nathaniel experienced the sting of this change firsthand. It was a warm summer day, and Nathaniel had decided to take David to Brookshire Park, a local favorite where families often gathered for picnics and games. The park had once been a place of relaxation and friendly faces for Nathaniel, but as he pushed David's stroller along the winding path, he could feel the eyes of other parents on him. Their conversations seemed to quiet as he passed, their glances lingering a little too long on David. Trying to brush off the discomfort, Nathaniel found an empty bench by the playground and helped David out of his stroller. The boy immediately toddled toward the sandbox, his small hands already reaching for the plastic shovel and bucket he had brought from home. Nathaniel watched with a smile as David played, his joy infectious. But as he glanced around, he noticed that none of the other children had joined David in the sandbox. Instead, they hovered near their parents, casting confused or curious glances at the little boy with dark curls who played alone. Nathaniel's smile faded. It wasn't long before one of the mothers, a woman Nathaniel vaguely recognized as the wife of a local businessman, approached the bench where he sat. Her posture was stiff, and her expression was strained, as though she was forcing herself to speak. "Dr. Harris," she began, her voice tight. I wanted to talk to you." Nathaniel looked up, already sensing that this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "Of course. What's on your mind?" The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at her child, who was playing a few feet away. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully before speaking again. "It's about your son," she said, her voice lowering slightly. "You must understand. Some of the parents here are concerned." Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "Concerned about what exactly?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Well, you know how small towns are. People talk. And, well, it's not just that you adopted a black child. It's that we're not sure it's the right environment for him." "The right environment?" Nathaniel repeated, his voice hardening. "Are you saying this park isn't a safe place for my son?" She flushed, clearly caught off guard by his response. No, of course not," she said quickly. "It's just, people worry. Children can be cruel. And, well, they notice things." Nathaniel felt his pulse quicken, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "So, because my son looks different, he doesn't belong here." The woman's eyes flickered with discomfort. "I'm not saying that exactly. But Brookshire isn't like, well, it's not like some of the bigger cities. People here are set in their ways. They might not be as accepting as you might hope." For a long moment, Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply stared at the woman, his jaw clenched. He had known this day would come, the day when someone would confront him openly about David's place in Brookshire. But it didn't make the sting of her words any less painful. "I appreciate your concern," Nathaniel said finally, his voice cold. "But my son has every right to be here, just like any other child. And if people in this town have a problem with that, then maybe it's Brookshire that needs to change, not my son." The woman blinked, her mouth opening and closing as though she wanted to argue, but no words came. She simply nodded stiffly before turning and walking back to her child. Nathaniel watched her go, his hands trembling with anger. He glanced at David, still blissfully unaware of the tension around him, happily scooping sand into his bucket. The sight of his son's innocence only made Nathaniel's resolve stronger. He wouldn't let the small minds of this town dictate how he raised his child. But as he sat there, his mind racing, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next challenge came not from the park, but from Nathaniel's very workplace. Brookshire General Hospital had always been a place where Nathaniel felt respected and valued. As one of the leading surgeons, he had built a reputation for excellence, saving countless lives over the years. But after adopting David, even the hospital seemed to change. It started with subtle shifts in behavior. Colleagues who had once greeted him with friendly smiles now offered curt nods, their conversations growing quieter when he entered the room. The nurses, who had always been warm and supportive, became more formal, their tone more professional than familiar. At first, Nathaniel tried to ignore it, telling himself that he was imagining things, but as the weeks passed, the distance grew more pronounced. Then came the surgeries. Nathaniel had always been proud of his steady hands, his ability to focus under pressure. But the stress of balancing fatherhood with his demanding career had begun to take its toll. He was tired, more tired than he had ever been before, and the exhaustion showed in his work. One afternoon, during a particularly delicate operation, Nathaniel made a small mistake. It was nothing catastrophic, and he corrected it quickly, but it didn't go unnoticed. After the surgery, as Nathaniel scrubbed out in the hospital's sterile changing room, Dr. Meredith Lawson, his department head, approached him. "Nathaniel," she said, her tone unusually serious, "we need to talk." He looked up, already sensing what was coming. "About the surgery." Dr. Lawson nodded, crossing her arms. "You know I respect you, Nathaniel. You're one of the best surgeons we have. But lately, there have been some concerns." "Concerns?" Nathaniel repeated, frowning. "About what?" She hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Some of the staff have noticed that your focus seems off. You've been making small errors, nothing major, but noticeable. And with your new responsibilities at home, well, people are starting to wonder if you're stretched too thin." Nathaniel felt a surge of frustration. He had been trying so hard to balance everything, his career, his patients, and being a father to David. But it seemed like no matter how hard he worked, people were questioning his ability to do both. "I'm handling it," he said, his voice tight. "Yes, it's been an adjustment, but I'm not letting it affect my work." Dr. Lawson gave him a sympathetic look. "I know you're doing your best, Nathaniel, but maybe you should consider taking a step back, just for a little while. Focus on your family." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "I don't need to step back, Meredith. I can do both. I've been doing both." She sighed, clearly not wanting to argue with him. "I'm just looking out for you, Nathaniel. And for David. You're a great father, and you're an excellent surgeon. But you're only human. No one can do everything." Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply nodded, his mind already racing with how he would prove her, and everyone else, wrong. As time went on, the weight of expectation, both as a surgeon and as a father, became heavier. Nathaniel found himself constantly torn between his responsibilities at the hospital and his need to be there for David. The town's judgment didn't make things any easier. Every day, it seemed like there was some new rumor or whisper about how he was overextending himself, or how David was out of place in Brookshire. The worst of it came when David started preschool. Nathaniel had enrolled him in Brookshire Academy, the same private school that many of the town's more affluent families sent their children to. He had hoped that the school's reputation for academic excellence would give David the best start in life, but instead, it became a battleground for prejudice. The first sign of trouble came just a few weeks into the school year. Nathaniel received a call from the school's principal, Mrs. Hargrove, requesting a meeting. As Nathaniel sat in Mrs. Hargrove's office, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The principal, an older woman with sharp features and an air of authority, folded her hands on the desk before speaking. "Dr. Harris," she began, her tone formal, "we've noticed some issues with David's adjustment to the school." Nathaniel's stomach tightened. "What kind of issues?" Mrs. Hargrove sighed. "Some of the other children have been hesitant to interact with David. There have been reports of name-calling and exclusion during recess. We've also received some complaints from parents who are concerned about David's presence here." Nathaniel's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Concerned about what exactly? The principal shifted in her seat, avoiding his gaze. "Well, you understand, Brookshire Academy has a long-standing tradition of certain demographics. Some of the parents feel that David's background may create a difficult environment for their children." Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists under the desk, but he kept his voice steady. "So you're saying that because my son is black, he doesn't belong here?" Mrs. Hargrove raised a hand, as if to placate him. No, that's not what we're saying. It's just that this school may not be the best fit for him. It's a very traditional environment, and we want to make sure that David feels welcome." Nathaniel stared at her, incredulous. "You think pulling him out of school is the solution? You think that's going to make him feel welcome?" Mrs. Hargrove faltered, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "We're just trying to avoid any further incidents." Nathaniel stood up, his heart pounding with anger. "David stays," he said firmly. "He has every right to be here, just like every other child. If the other kids or their parents have a problem with that, then maybe it's them who need to change." Mrs. Hargrove didn't respond, her face a mask of politeness. But as Nathaniel left her office, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the battle ahead. For David, the challenges of being different in Brookshire became more apparent with each passing day. At just 4 years old, he didn't fully understand why the other children avoided him or why some of the parents whispered when they saw him with Nathaniel. But he felt the coldness, the exclusion. And though Nathaniel did his best to shield his son from the worst of it, there were some things he couldn't protect him from. One evening, as Nathaniel was tucking David into bed, the little boy looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. "Daddy," he asked softly, "why don't the other kids want to play with me?" The question hit Nathaniel like a punch to the gut. He had been dreading this moment, the moment when David would start to understand the harsh reality of the world around him. He sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair as he searched for the right words. "It's not because of anything you did, buddy," Nathaniel said gently. "Some people, they don't understand things that are different. They're scared of what they don't know. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. You're perfect just the way you are." David frowned, his small brow furrowed in confusion. "But why do they care that I'm different?" Nathaniel sighed, wishing he had an easy answer. "Because some people think that being different is a bad thing. But it's not. Being different is what makes you special. And one day, they'll see that." David didn't seem convinced, but he nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with sleep. Nathaniel kissed him on the forehead, his heart aching as he left the room. As he stood in the hallway, he vowed to himself that he would do whatever it took to protect David, to show him that love and kindness could overcome even the most deeply ingrained prejudices. But deep down, Nathaniel knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Brookshire wasn't just any small town. It was a town rooted in tradition, where change came slowly, if at all. And as the whispers grew louder and the stares more intense, Nathaniel realized that he wasn't just fighting for David's future. He was fighting for their right to exist as a family in a place that didn't seem to want them. As the years passed, Nathaniel and David's bond only grew stronger. David thrived under his father's love and guidance, growing into a bright, inquisitive child with a passion for learning. But the shadow of Brookshire's prejudice loomed large over their lives. The town's unspoken rules about race and class seemed to dictate every interaction, every decision. Yet through it all, Nathaniel remained steadfast. He had faced worse in his career, lives hanging in the balance, impossible odds, and he knew that giving up on his son was not an option. The whispers, the stares, the judgment, they would all fade away in time. What mattered was the love between father and son, the unbreakable bond that had formed the day he found David abandoned outside the hospital. But as Nathaniel soon discovered, love alone would not be enough to shield them from the storm that was brewing. The town's prejudice was only growing stronger, and the day would soon come when everything they had fought for would be put to the ultimate test. For now, Nathaniel could only hold David close, knowing that the world outside their home was growing darker by the day. And when the time came, he would stand by his son's side, no matter what. The breaking point. As the years passed, the undercurrent of tension in Brookshire grew stronger. David, now 7 years old, was a bright, lively boy, full of curiosity and enthusiasm for life. He excelled at school, despite the cold reception from many of his classmates, and at home, he thrived under Nathaniel's care. Their home had become a sanctuary, a safe, warm space where they could be themselves, freed from the judgment that permeated so much of their lives outside. But the growing strain was impossible to ignore. Nathaniel could feel it in the subtle shifts in people's behavior, the way colleagues and neighbors had grown more distant, more formal, as though they weren't sure how to interact with him and his son anymore. He could see it in the way David came home from school, his usually bright demeanor dimmed by the reality of the world around him. The pressure was building, and Nathaniel knew that something had to give. It came to a head one fateful afternoon, when the weight of Brookshire's prejudice finally crashed down on them. It was a typical Friday, and Nathaniel had just finished up a long day at the hospital. He picked David up from school, as he always did, and they drove home in their usual comfortable silence. David was quieter than usual, staring out the window as the familiar streets of Brookshire passed by. Nathaniel noticed but didn't press. David had his moods, like any other child, and sometimes it took a little while for him to open up. But when they got home, and David still hadn't said more than a few words, Nathaniel knew something was wrong. He found his son sitting at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped and his face downcast. Nathaniel set his keys on the counter and approached, sitting down across from him. "Hey, buddy, what's going on? You seem a little down." David didn't look up. His small hands fidgeted with the edge of his backpack, his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Daddy, why do people hate me?" Nathaniel felt his heart drop. The question, so direct and full of hurt, caught him off guard. He had always known that one day David would ask something like this, but hearing it now, seeing the pain in his son's eyes, made it all too real. "David," Nathaniel began, struggling to find the right words. "No one hates you. People, sometimes they just don't understand things that are different. And when they don't understand something, they act out of fear." "But why me?" David's voice cracked, tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't do anything. I'm just me." Nathaniel reached across the table and took David's hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, buddy. I know you didn't do anything wrong. And it's not fair that people are treating you this way. But sometimes people are afraid of what they don't know, and instead of trying to learn or understand, they hurt others." David sniffled, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Today at school, the kids were laughing at me again. They said I didn't belong here, that this wasn't my home." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He had known things were bad, but he hadn't realized how deeply it was affecting David, his son, the boy who had always been so full of life and curiosity, was now questioning his very right to exist in this town. "Listen to me, David," Nathaniel said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is your home. You belong here just as much as anyone else. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve to be here. You are my son, and I love you more than anything in this world. And no matter what anyone else says or does, that will never change." David looked up at him, his eyes still brimming with tears but filled with a flicker of hope. "Really, Daddy?" "Really," Nathaniel said, his voice softening. I know it's hard, but we're in this together, and we're going to get through it, no matter what." David nodded, though the sadness still lingered in his eyes. Nathaniel felt a pang of guilt. No child should have to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, especially not at David's age. But Nathaniel knew that shielding his son from the realities of the world would only go so far. They had to face this head-on, together. The next morning, Nathaniel made a decision. He couldn't let this go on any longer. The bullying at school, the coldness from the town, it had all reached a breaking point. He had tried to ignore it, to rise above it, but now, seeing the toll it was taking on David, he realized that something had to be done. Nathaniel decided to confront the issue head-on, starting with the school. He scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Hargrove, the principal, determined to address the bullying once and for all. When he arrived at the school, Mrs. Hargrove greeted him with the same overly polite smile she always wore, but Nathaniel could see the discomfort in her eyes. She knew why he was there, and she knew it wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "Dr. Harris," she said, gesturing for him to sit down in her office. "How can I help you today?" Nathaniel didn't waste any time. "It's about David. The bullying hasn't stopped. In fact, it's getting worse." Mrs. Hargrove sighed, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. "I'm aware that there have been some issues with David's classmates, but we're doing everything we can to address the situation. We've spoken to the other students, and we've made it clear that bullying won't be tolerated." "With all due respect," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with frustration, "that's not enough. My son comes home every day feeling like he doesn't belong. He's 7 years old, and he's already questioning whether he has the right to be here. This isn't just about kids being mean. It's about the environment this school is creating." Mrs. Hargrove's expression remained carefully neutral, but Nathaniel could see the cracks starting to form. She knew he was right, but admitting it would mean acknowledging that the school, and by extension, the town, had a much bigger problem than just a few unruly children. "I understand your concerns, Dr. Harris," she said after a long pause. "But Brookshire Academy has a certain culture. It's been this way for a long time, and while we're open to change, it's not something that can happen overnight." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "So you're saying that my son just has to deal with it? That he has to endure being ostracized and bullied because this school isn't ready for change?" Mrs. Hargrove looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm saying that we're doing our best, but sometimes these things take time." Nathaniel stood up, his frustration boiling over. "Well, time isn't something David has right now. He needs support, not excuses. And if this school can't provide that, then I'll find a place that can." Without waiting for a response, Nathaniel walked out of the office, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not let David be made to feel less than because of who he was. Nathaniel's frustration with the school was only the beginning. The town's attitude toward him and David had grown increasingly hostile, and it seemed like every day brought a new challenge. The whispers and stares had become a regular part of their lives, and Nathaniel could feel the walls closing in around them. One particularly cold winter morning, Nathaniel and David were walking through the town square on their way to pick up groceries. The streets were bustling with holiday shoppers, and the air was filled with the sound of cheerful Christmas music. But as they walked past the local coffee shop, Nathaniel caught sight of a group of parents sitting inside, their eyes following him and David as they passed. He tried to ignore it, but then he heard one of them, Tom Peterson, a local businessman and father to one of David's classmates, speak loud enough for them to hear. "I don't know what he was thinking, adopting a black kid in this town," Tom said, shaking his head. "He's just setting that boy up for failure." Nathaniel's steps faltered, and David looked up at him, his wide eyes filled with confusion. "What did he mean, Daddy?" Nathaniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep walking. "Nothing, buddy. Don't listen to him." But David wasn't satisfied with that answer. Why does everyone hate us? Nathaniel stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, crouching down to meet his son's gaze. He could see the hurt in David's eyes, the confusion and sadness that came from being treated as an outsider in his own town. "They don't hate us, David," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "They just don't understand. But we're going to show them. We're going to show them that love is stronger than hate, and that being different isn't a bad thing. It's what makes us special." David nodded slowly, but Nathaniel could tell that the words didn't quite reach him. He was too young to understand the complexities of racism and prejudice, but he was old enough to feel its sting. As they continued their walk through town, Nathaniel's mind raced. He couldn't let this continue. He had to find a way to protect David, to shield him from the cruelty of the world. But how? How could he fight an entire town's deeply ingrained beliefs? The answer came to him that night, as he sat in the quiet of his living room, David asleep in his bed. He realized that he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed help, allies who would stand with him and show Brookshire that change was possible. The next morning, Nathaniel made a decision. He would call a town meeting. He would gather the people of Brookshire, parents, teachers, business owners, anyone who had a stake in the future of the town, and he would make them listen. He would make them see that the path they were on was wrong, and that they had a choice. They could continue down this road of ignorance and hate, or they could choose love, acceptance, and understanding. It was a long shot, Nathaniel knew, but it was the only chance he had to make things right for David, and for every other child in Brookshire who had ever felt like they didn't belong. The meeting was set for the following week. Word spread quickly, and by the time the day arrived, the town hall was packed. Nathaniel stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked out at the sea of faces. Some were familiar, parents of David's classmates, colleagues from the hospital, while others were strangers. But all of them were here, waiting to hear what he had to say. Nathaniel cleared his throat, his palms slick with sweat. He had faced life and death situations in the operating room, but this, standing in front of his entire town, speaking out against the very fabric of its culture, felt far more daunting. "Thank you all for coming," Nathaniel began, his voice steady despite the nervousness coiling in his stomach. "I called this meeting because I believe we have a problem in Brookshire. And that problem is prejudice." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Nathaniel pressed on. "For years, this town has prided itself on its traditions, its values. But those traditions have left some of us feeling like we don't belong, like we're outsiders in our own community." He glanced around the room, his gaze settling on a few familiar faces: Tom Peterson, Mrs. Hargrove, and others who had made it clear that they didn't approve of his decision to adopt David. "My son, David, is a bright, beautiful child. But ever since he came into my life, he has been treated differently by this town. He's been bullied at school, ostracized by his classmates, and made to feel like he doesn't belong. And that's not something I can accept." The room was silent now, all eyes on Nathaniel. "We teach our children that they should treat others with kindness and respect," Nathaniel continued, his voice growing stronger. "But how can we expect them to do that if we, as adults, aren't setting that example? How can we tell them to be accepting and inclusive if we're not willing to do the same?" Nathaniel paused, letting his words sink in. He could see the discomfort on some faces, but he could also see something else, something that looked like understanding. "I'm not asking for special treatment for my son," he said. "I'm asking for fairness, for kindness, for the opportunity for every child in this town to grow up feeling safe and loved, no matter what they look like or where they come from." A hush fell over the room, and for a moment Nathaniel thought that perhaps his words had fallen on deaf ears. But then, slowly, one person began to clap. It was a soft, hesitant sound, but it grew louder as others joined in. Within moments, the room was filled with applause, some polite, some more enthusiastic. Nathaniel stood there, stunned, as the crowd rose to their feet. Perhaps, he thought, this town was ready for change after all. The ripple of change. The thunderous applause in the town hall felt like a lifeline to Nathaniel. As he stood before the crowd, watching the people of Brookshire rise to their feet, clapping, cheering, and murmuring in what could only be described as a shared collective release of tension, Nathaniel felt an overwhelming mixture of hope and relief. Maybe, just maybe, the town was ready to listen, ready to change, ready to embrace a new kind of Brookshire, one that didn't cling so tightly to the exclusionary traditions of the past. But as he looked out over the room, he also saw the familiar faces of those who remained seated, arms crossed, their expressions unreadable or clearly disapproving. Not everyone was ready to welcome this change, and Nathaniel knew the road ahead would still be long and filled with challenges. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly, and stepped down from the small podium, knowing this was only the first step. After the meeting, a few people approached him with words of encouragement, parents who had been hesitant before, colleagues who had distanced themselves, but were now reconsidering their silence. Nathaniel accepted their gestures with gratitude, but his eyes were always scanning the room, searching for the one face that mattered most to him. David. David had sat in the front row during the entire meeting, his wide eyes glued to his father as he spoke. Nathaniel had worried that his son might be too young to understand the significance of what was happening. But as he approached, David stood up and threw his arms around his father's waist. "You were really brave, Daddy," David said, his voice muffled against Nathaniel's coat. "I'm proud of you." Nathaniel knelt down so he could meet David's gaze, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm proud of you too, buddy. You're the bravest person I know." David beamed, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The weight of the town's judgment, the years of whispers and stares, all of it seemed insignificant in the face of the love between father and son. In the days that followed, the impact of the town meeting rippled through Brookshire in ways Nathaniel hadn't fully anticipated. At first, there was a palpable tension, as if the town itself was holding its breath, unsure of how to proceed after such a public confrontation of its values. But slowly, subtly, things began to shift. The local newspaper ran a front-page article about the meeting, quoting Nathaniel's speech and highlighting the conversation about prejudice in the town. It was the first time a major publication in Brookshire had addressed the issue so openly, and the response was swift. Letters to the editor poured in, some praising Nathaniel's bravery, others expressing discomfort with the changes he was calling for. But the most surprising thing was that for the first time, people were talking about it. Conversations that had once taken place in whispers behind closed doors were now happening in the open. At the grocery store, in the post office, at the local diner, people were discussing the town's deep-seated biases. Some were defensive, insisting that Brookshire had always been a good, decent place, and that these claims of prejudice were exaggerated. Others, particularly younger families, seemed relieved that the issue was finally being brought to light. Nathaniel overheard a conversation between two women at the coffee shop one morning, and though they didn't notice him, their words stayed with him long after he left. "It's about time someone said something," one of them remarked, stirring her coffee absently. "I've seen the way people look at that poor boy. It's not right." Her friend nodded. "I know. My son's been asking questions too, about why David gets treated differently. How are we supposed to teach our kids to be kind when the adults can't even do it?" It was in these small, everyday moments that Nathaniel began to see the potential for change, but not everyone was on board. 2 weeks after the meeting, Nathaniel received a call from Brookshire Academy. The school had been quieter than usual about David since the meeting. No updates from Mrs. Hargrove, no complaints from parents. Nathaniel had hoped it was a sign that things were improving, that maybe the school was finally taking steps to address the bullying. But the voice on the other end of the line quickly dashed those hopes. "Dr. Harris, this is Mrs. Hargrove. I'm afraid we need to discuss a situation that's come up with David." Nathaniel's stomach tightened. What kind of situation? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "It's probably best if we discuss this in person." Can you come by the school today?" Nathaniel agreed, though his mind raced with worry. What had happened? Had the bullying escalated? Was David in trouble? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When Nathaniel arrived at the school, Mrs. Hargrove greeted him in the front office. Her usual stiff demeanor was even more formal than usual, her expression carefully neutral as she led him to her office. David was already there, sitting in one of the chairs in front of her desk, his small hands clenched in his lap. His face was pale, and Nathaniel could tell he'd been crying. Mrs. Hargrove sat down behind her desk, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Dr. Harris," she began, her tone professional but cold, "we've had an incident with David today." There was an altercation at recess involving several of the other children. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at his son. What kind of altercation? Mrs. Hargrove sighed. "It seems that some of the other boys were teasing David. Again. And it escalated into a physical confrontation." David looked down at his lap, his shoulders slumped. Nathaniel reached over and placed a reassuring hand on his back, trying to keep his voice steady. "Did the other boys hit David?" Mrs. Hargrove hesitated. "It's not that simple. One of the boys made a rather inappropriate comment about David's race, and in response, David shoved him." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. An inappropriate comment? What exactly did he say? Mrs. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to repeat it verbatim, but suffice it to say it was racially charged." Nathaniel's mind raced. "And what happened to the other boys?" "Well," Mrs. Hargrove began, "we've spoken to all the children involved, and we've disciplined them appropriately. However, I'm afraid we're going to have to suspend David for his part in the altercation." Nathaniel stared at her, disbelief flooding through him. "You're suspending David? After what those boys said to him? They're the ones who started this." "I understand your frustration, Dr. Harris," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice still maddeningly calm. "But we have a zero-tolerance policy for physical violence at Brookshire Academy. Regardless of the circumstances, David did push one of the other students, and we can't overlook that." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His son had been verbally attacked, racially attacked, and yet he was the one being punished. The injustice of it made his blood boil. "This is unacceptable," Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're punishing my son for defending himself against racist bullying. This is exactly the kind of behavior I was talking about at the town meeting. You're perpetuating the problem." Mrs. Hargrove's expression remained neutral, though there was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. "I assure you, Dr. Harris, we take these incidents very seriously. But we also have to follow the school's policies." Nathaniel stood up, fury coursing through him. "Then maybe it's your policies that need to change." He turned to David, who looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Come on, buddy. We're leaving." As they walked out of the school, Nathaniel's mind was racing. The town might be starting to change, but the school clearly wasn't. And if Brookshire Academy couldn't provide a safe and supportive environment for David, then it wasn't the place for him. That evening, after David had gone to bed, Nathaniel sat alone in the living room, his mind churning with thoughts of the day's events. He couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Hargrove's calm, detached demeanor as she suspended his son, as though David's pain and frustration were just another bureaucratic inconvenience to be dealt with. He thought about the other boys, the ones who had taunted David, and how they would probably never face the same kind of scrutiny or punishment. The injustice of it all burned inside him. He had always known that raising a black child in a predominantly white town like Brookshire would come with challenges, but he hadn't realized just how deeply rooted those challenges were in the very fabric of the town's institutions. The school, the community, even the hospital where he worked. Everything was built on a foundation that had been designed to exclude people like David. And now that Nathaniel was challenging that foundation, the pushback was stronger than ever. But as Nathaniel sat there, staring out at the darkened street outside his window, he realized something else. The change he was fighting for wasn't just for David. It was for every child in Brookshire who had ever felt different, every family that had been made to feel like they didn't belong. It was for the future of the town itself, a future where people didn't have to choose between staying true to their identities and being accepted by their community. Nathaniel knew he couldn't back down now. If anything, the events at the school had only strengthened his resolve. He had to fight for David, for the town, for the future they both deserved. The next day, Nathaniel made another decision. He called an emergency meeting with the parents of Brookshire Academy. It was time for them to confront what was happening in their children's school. Word spread quickly, and by the time the meeting took place, the school auditorium was packed. Parents filled the rows of chairs, some looking curious, others defensive. Mrs. Hargrove sat near the front, her expression unreadable. Nathaniel stood at the front of the room, just as he had at the town hall weeks earlier. This time, though, the stakes felt even higher. He wasn't just speaking for himself and David. He was speaking for every child in that school who had ever been bullied, excluded, or made to feel less than because of who they were. "I called this meeting because we have a problem," Nathaniel began, his voice steady and clear. "And that problem is how we're treating the children in this school." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We've seen time and time again how kids are being singled out, bullied, and ostracized because of their race, their background, or simply because they don't fit the mold of what this town has always been. And it has to stop." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Nathaniel pressed on. "My son, David, has been the target of this kind of treatment for years. He's been bullied, called names, made to feel like he doesn't belong. And when he finally stood up for himself, he was punished for it." He could see the discomfort on the faces of some of the parents, but he didn't shy away from the truth. "This isn't just about David. This is about every child in this school. We've created an environment where certain kids are made to feel like outsiders, like they're less deserving of kindness and respect. And that's not just hurting those kids. It's hurting all of us." Nathaniel looked around the room, meeting the eyes of as many parents as he could. "We have a choice. We can continue to ignore this problem, or we can address it head-on. We can teach our kids to be better, to be kinder, to be more accepting. But it starts with us. It starts with the decisions we make as parents, as teachers, as a community." The room was silent for a long moment, and Nathaniel wasn't sure what kind of response he would get. But then, just like at the town hall, one person began to clap. Slowly, others joined in, until the room was filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't universal. There were still some who sat with their arms crossed, their expressions closed off. But it was enough. Nathaniel could see that enough people were ready to make a change, to stand up for what was right. As the applause died down, one of the parents, Sarah Johnson, the mother of one of David's classmates, stood up. "Dr. Harris," she said, her voice shaky but determined, "you're right. We've been letting this happen for too long. I want to be part of the solution." Her words seemed to open the floodgates. Other parents began to speak up, sharing their own concerns, their own stories of witnessing the exclusion and bullying that had gone unchecked for so long. Some even admitted their own roles in perpetuating it, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still parents who refused to acknowledge the problem. But it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt hopeful. Over the next few months, Brookshire Academy began to implement real changes. New anti-bullying policies were put in place, teachers received diversity training, and parents were encouraged to have open conversations with their children about kindness and inclusion. The changes weren't immediate, and there were still bumps along the way, but the atmosphere in the school began to shift. David noticed the difference too. He still faced challenges. There were still kids who teased him, still parents who gave him wary looks, but for the first time, he also had allies. He made new friends, kids who had once kept their distance, but were now eager to include him in their games and activities. Slowly but surely, Brookshire was starting to feel like a place where he could belong. One afternoon, as Nathaniel picked David up from school, he noticed something that made his heart swell with pride. David was standing by the swings, laughing with a group of his classmates, his face lit up with joy. For the first time in a long time, Nathaniel saw his son surrounded by acceptance and friendship. As they walked home together, David looked up at his father, his smile bright and carefree. "Daddy," he said, "I think things are getting better." Nathaniel smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Yeah, buddy, I think they are." And though Nathaniel knew there were still challenges ahead, still people who would resist the changes, still battles to be fought, he also knew that they had come a long way. Together, they had started something that couldn't be undone. The future of Brookshire was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, it felt full of possibility. And as Nathaniel held his son's hand, he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, just as they always had. Because love, real, unconditional love, was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. And that was enough. The unexpected test. As winter melted into spring, Brookshire was slowly coming to terms with the changes Nathaniel had set in motion. The town, once stubbornly clinging to its old ways, was showing signs of growth. Conversations about race, acceptance, and inclusivity, once considered taboo, were now common in coffee shops, at town hall meetings, and in school classrooms. Parents were talking to their children about the importance of kindness, of seeing beyond skin color, and of embracing differences. Nathaniel had never imagined that his small, quiet town could undergo such a transformation, but it wasn't lost on him that this progress was fragile. It rested on the willingness of the people in Brookshire to keep moving forward, to keep challenging their own biases. And while some were wholeheartedly embracing the change, others were still resistant, clinging to the old ways with the same stubbornness that had caused so much pain. Despite the progress, Nathaniel knew there was still a long road ahead. And as much as he tried to shield David from the ugliness that still existed in parts of their community, he also knew that it was inevitable that they would face new challenges. What he didn't expect was just how soon, and how suddenly, those challenges would come. It began on a Friday afternoon in late April, just as the school year was beginning to wind down. Nathaniel had left work early to pick up David from school, looking forward to spending the weekend together. They had planned to visit a nearby nature reserve, one of David's favorite places to explore, and Nathaniel was eager to have some quality time with his son. As he pulled up to Brookshire Academy, he noticed a group of parents gathered near the entrance, their faces drawn and serious. His heart sank immediately. He knew something was wrong. Nathaniel parked the car and hurried toward the entrance, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of David. His stomach tightened when he saw Mrs. Hargrove standing near the door, her usual composed demeanor replaced by one of visible distress. "Dr. Harris," she called as soon as she saw him. "We need to talk." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. "Where's David? What happened?" Mrs. Hargrove led him inside, her expression grim. "David is fine, physically," she said, though her tone suggested that there was more to the story. "But there's been an incident. He's in my office now." Nathaniel followed her through the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. As they approached the office, Nathaniel saw David sitting in one of the chairs outside, his face pale, his eyes red from crying. His small hands were clenched tightly in his lap, and when he saw Nathaniel, he looked up with an expression of pure anguish. Nathaniel rushed to his side, kneeling down so that he was eye level with his son. "David, what's going on? Are you okay?" David shook his head, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "Daddy, they said terrible things." Nathaniel's heart constricted painfully. Who said terrible things? Before David could answer, Mrs. Hargrove stepped in. "It's best if we discuss this inside, Dr. Harris." Nathaniel stood up, his mind already spinning with worst-case scenarios. He followed Mrs. Hargrove into her office, where another figure was waiting. Tom Peterson, one of the town's more prominent figures, and a man who had always been vocally opposed to the changes taking place in Brookshire, was standing near the window, his face stony and cold. Nathaniel felt a rush of anger at the sight of him. "What's going on here?" Nathaniel demanded, his voice sharp. "Why is David so upset?" Mrs. Hargrove closed the door behind them, her expression strained. "There was an incident in the cafeteria today," she began, her voice carefully measured. "David was involved in an altercation with Tom's son, Eric, and two other boys." Nathaniel's fists clenched. "Another altercation? Is this like last time?" Mrs. Hargrove winced. "I'm afraid it's worse than that." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "What happened?" Tom Peterson, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was low and controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge of anger beneath the surface. "My son told me what happened, Dr. Harris. David attacked him and his friends, pushed them, yelled at them, completely unprovoked." Nathaniel's stomach churned. Unprovoked. That doesn't sound like David at all. Tom's eyes flashed with anger. "Maybe not to you, but my son has the bruises to prove it." Nathaniel turned to Mrs. Hargrove, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "What really happened here?" Mrs. Hargrove sighed, looking down at her hands for a moment before meeting Nathaniel's gaze. "There's no easy way to say this, Dr. Harris. According to the accounts we've gathered from the other students, it appears that Eric and the other boys used some highly inappropriate language toward David." Nathaniel's heart sank. "Racial slurs." Mrs. Hargrove nodded, her face pale. "Yes, they called him names, terrible ones. David tried to walk away at first, but when the taunting continued, he lost his temper." Nathaniel felt a wave of nausea roll through him. He knew David had been struggling with bullying since he first started at Brookshire Academy, but to hear that it had escalated to this level was like a punch to the gut. His son, his sweet, kind, gentle son, had been pushed to the breaking point by the cruelty of other children. How did this escalate into a physical altercation? Nathaniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated before answering. After the boys used the slurs, David tried to leave, but they followed him. When one of the boys, Eric, grabbed David's backpack and refused to give it back, David pushed him. Tom's eyes narrowed. And that's when Eric defended himself. It wasn't just David who was attacked. Nathaniel felt his blood boil. Defended himself. From what? My son was defending himself from your son's racism. Tom's face turned red with anger. You're blowing this out of proportion, Harris. Kids say things. It doesn't mean it's some grand racial conspiracy. Nathaniel took a step closer, his hands trembling with fury. My son has been dealing with this for years, and every time it's swept under the rug. Every time people like you brush it off as just kids being kids. It gets worse. This isn't just about words, Tom. This is about the environment that's been allowed to fester here, and how it's poisoning our children. Tom opened his mouth to respond, but Mrs. Hargrove quickly intervened, stepping between the two men. Please, let's keep this civil. Our priority should be finding a way to resolve this situation peacefully. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, willing himself to calm down. What happens now? Mrs. Hargrove's expression was grim. We'll have to conduct a formal investigation, but given the nature of the incident, I'm afraid all the boys involved will be suspended. Nathaniel's heart sank. Suspended. Again. He looked at Mrs. Hargrove, his frustration mounting. David was the one being attacked. He was defending himself. How can you punish him for that? Mrs. Hargrove's face was drawn with stress. I understand your position, Dr. Harris, but the school has a zero-tolerance policy for physical altercations. We can't make exceptions, regardless of the circumstances. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he knew there was no point in arguing further. The system wasn't designed to protect children like David. It was designed to maintain the status quo. And in a town like Brookshire, That meant children of color were often left to fend for themselves. Later that evening, back at home, Nathaniel sat with David in the living room, trying to help his son process what had happened. David had been quiet since they left the school, his eyes downcast and his shoulders slumped. Nathaniel had tried to reassure him, but he could see that the weight of the day's events was pressing down on him like a physical burden. "David," Nathaniel said softly, sitting down beside him on the couch, "do you want to talk about what happened today?" David shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to get so mad, Daddy. I tried to walk away. I really did. But they kept calling me those names, and I couldn't take it anymore." Nathaniel's heart broke for his son. He pulled David into a tight hug, holding him close as he spoke. "I know, buddy. I know you tried, and I'm proud of you for that. It's not your fault. What they said to you was wrong, and you had every right to be angry." David sniffled, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. "But now I'm in trouble, just like last time." Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, and it's not fair, but I want you to know that you didn't do anything wrong. You stood up for yourself, and that takes courage. I'm going to keep fighting for you, David. I'm going to make sure that this never happens again." David looked up at him, his eyes filled with both hope and uncertainty. "But how, Daddy? How can you stop them?" Nathaniel didn't have a perfect answer. He knew that this wasn't a problem that could be solved overnight. But he also knew that he couldn't back down now. The fight for David's future, the fight for justice and equality, was bigger than one incident at a school. It was about changing the way people thought, the way they treated each other, the way they raised their children. "I don't have all the answers," Nathaniel admitted. "But I do know one thing. We're not alone in this. There are people in this town who want to help, people who believe in what's right, and we're going to keep working together to make sure that Brookshire is a place where everyone belongs." David nodded, though Nathaniel could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. It would take time for his son to fully believe in the possibility of change. But Nathaniel was determined to show him that change was possible, that they could build a future where David would never have to feel like an outsider again. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel threw himself into his work, both at the hospital and within the community. The incident at the school had reignited his resolve to push for even more changes in Brookshire, and he wasn't going to stop until he saw real progress. He organized meetings with other parents, teachers, and community leaders, calling for reforms to the school's policies on bullying and discrimination. He pushed for greater accountability, for diversity training for staff, and for an overhaul of the way the school handled incidents of racism. And though the process was slow, there were signs that his efforts were making a difference. At the same time, Nathaniel worked closely with the town council to implement broader changes across Brookshire. New community programs were introduced to promote inclusivity and celebrate diversity. The town's annual festival, which had once been a celebration of its traditional, predominantly white heritage, was reimagined as a multicultural event, with performances, food, and art from a wide range of cultures. Slowly but surely, Brookshire was starting to become the town Nathaniel had always hoped it could be. But the real change came not from policy or programs, but from the people themselves. One evening, as Nathaniel and David were walking home from a community meeting, they passed by the park where David had once been taunted and excluded by the other children. Now it was filled with laughter and the sound of kids playing together. Black, white, and brown, all running and chasing each other with the carefree joy that only children seemed capable of. As they walked, Nathaniel felt David tug on his sleeve. "Daddy, look," David said, pointing to a group of kids playing soccer nearby. Nathaniel followed his gaze and saw something that made his heart swell with pride. Among the children playing was Eric Peterson, the same boy who had been at the center of the altercation at school. But now, instead of taunting or bullying David, Eric was smiling and waving, calling out for David to join them in their game. David looked up at Nathaniel, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "Can I go play with them?" Nathaniel smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Of course you can, buddy." David hesitated for a moment, then broke into a wide grin and ran toward the group of kids, his laughter joining theirs as he was welcomed into the game. Nathaniel watched from a distance, his heart filled with a quiet, overwhelming joy. This, he realized, was what they had been fighting for. Not just for policies and programs, but for moments like this. Moments when children could look past their differences and simply see each other as friends. As the sun set over Brookshire, casting a warm, golden glow over the town, Nathaniel stood there watching his son, feeling the weight of the past years lift from his shoulders. The road ahead would still be long, and there would still be challenges to face. But for now, he allowed himself to believe that the future, David's future, was filled with hope. And that was more than enough. The unseen ripple. The summer after David's altercation at Brookshire Academy was a turning point, not just for Nathaniel and his son, but for the entire town of Brookshire. The quiet, hidden prejudices that had once simmered beneath the surface of the community had been dragged into the open, forcing everyone to confront the consequences of their silence. For the first time in its long traditional history, Brookshire was not just talking about change, it was living it. But as with all change, it came slowly, and not without resistance. Nathaniel knew that some hearts and minds were beginning to shift, but he also knew that old habits, especially those rooted in generational bias, would be hard to break. And though the town was moving forward, the scars of the past had not fully healed. Nathaniel could see it in the way David still hesitated when walking into school, as though bracing himself for another blow that might come at any moment. He could hear it in the conversations between parents, in the subtle, lingering discomfort when the subject of race came up. Progress had been made, but the journey was far from over. The summer stretched on, filled with long, hot days and occasional thunderstorms that broke the heat but seemed to intensify the tension in the air. Nathaniel and David spent more time together than they had in years, making the most of the school break and enjoying the peaceful moments that had once seemed so rare. They'd visited the nearby nature reserve, went on weekend hikes, and spent lazy afternoons at home, reading or watching old movies. It was the kind of summer that Nathaniel had always wanted for his son, free of fear, filled with joy and exploration. But even as they tried to create a sense of normalcy, the outside world continued to encroach on their peace. One afternoon, about halfway through the summer, Nathaniel received a phone call that shattered the fragile calm they had built. He was in his study, going over some paperwork for the hospital, when the phone rang. At first, he considered letting it go to voicemail. After all, it was his day off, and he had promised David they would go to the park later that day. But something compelled him to answer, and when he picked up the phone, he immediately recognized the voice on the other end. Dr. Harris, this is Meredith Lawson. Dr. Lawson was a colleague of Nathaniel's at Brookshire General Hospital and the head of the pediatric department. They had worked together on numerous cases over the years, and Nathaniel had always admired her calm, methodical approach to medicine. But there was something in her voice now, an urgency, a tension, that immediately set Nathaniel on edge. Meredith, Nathaniel said, sitting up straighter in his chair. What's going on? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, as though she was gathering her thoughts. Nathaniel, I hate to bother you on your day off, but we have a situation at the hospital. Several children have come in over the past few days with similar symptoms: eye fever, severe fatigue, difficulty breathing. We've run tests, but so far, we can't identify the cause. Nathaniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. How many cases are we talking about? 5 so far, Meredith replied, her voice tight. But the number seems to be growing. And, Nathaniel, all of the children are from the same part of town, the west side, near the industrial area. Nathaniel's mind raced. The west side of Brookshire was predominantly home to lower-income families, many of whom worked in the factories or warehouses that bordered the town. It was an area that had been largely overlooked in the recent push for change, despite Nathaniel's efforts to bring attention to the socioeconomic disparities within Brookshire. If there was an outbreak of some kind, it would likely hit the most vulnerable families the hardest. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Nathaniel said, already reaching for his keys. "We need to get ahead of this." When Nathaniel arrived at Brookshire General Hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Meredith was waiting for him just inside the entrance, her face drawn with stress. She led him through the bustling corridors to the pediatric ward, where several of the children were being treated. Nathaniel scanned the charts, his mind immediately going into diagnostic mode. The symptoms were worrying: high fevers that didn't respond to standard treatments, respiratory issues, and severe lethargy. It reminded him of cases he had seen during his residency, where environmental factors played a role in sudden outbreaks. But without more information, it was impossible to say for certain what was causing the illness. Meredith sighed, leaning against the counter as they reviewed the test results. "We've ruled out most of the usual suspects: viral infections, bacterial contamination, but nothing fits. And the fact that all of these kids are from the same area." Nathaniel nodded, his mind racing. "It's too much of a coincidence. We need to start looking into environmental factors, water contamination, air quality, anything that could be affecting that part of town specifically." Meredith glanced at him, her expression grim. "I've already contacted the public health department, but we both know how slow they can be. And in the meantime, more kids are getting sick." Nathaniel set down the charts, his resolve hardening. "We don't have time to wait. I'm going to start making some calls, see if we can expedite the investigation. But in the meantime, we need to start treating this like a potential public health crisis." Meredith nodded, her jaw tight. "Agreed. I'll coordinate with the other departments, make sure we're prepared for an influx of patients." As Nathaniel left the pediatric ward, his mind was already spinning with the possibilities. If this was some kind of environmental contamination, the entire west side of Brookshire could be at risk. And while the town had made strides in addressing issues of race and inclusion, the socioeconomic disparities had largely been ignored. The west side had been neglected for years, and now it seemed that neglect was coming back to haunt them. Nathaniel couldn't help but think of David, safe at home, far from the epicenter of the outbreak. But he also thought of the other children in Brookshire, children who, like David, deserved a chance at a healthy, safe future. He knew that this crisis could either bring the town together or tear it apart, and he wasn't about to let it be the latter. Over the next few days, the situation in Brookshire grew more dire. More children were admitted to the hospital, all from the same area, all with the same baffling symptoms. The public health department had finally sent a team to investigate, but progress was slow, and the community was growing increasingly anxious. Nathaniel threw himself into the work, spending long hours at the hospital and coordinating with local officials to try and pinpoint the source of the outbreak. He and Meredith worked around the clock, consulting with specialists from other hospitals and reviewing every piece of data they could gather. But despite their best efforts, the cause of the illness remained elusive. As the days wore on, Nathaniel could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was used to dealing with high-stakes medical cases, but this was different. This was his community, his town, and these were the children of people he knew, people he had grown up with, people he had fought alongside in the struggle for a more inclusive Brookshire. One evening, after an exhausting day at the hospital, Nathaniel returned home to find David waiting for him on the porch. The boy's face lit up when he saw his father, but there was a hint of worry in his eyes. "Daddy, are the kids at the hospital going to be okay?" David asked as Nathaniel sat down beside him. Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I hope so, buddy. We're doing everything we can to help them." David frowned, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. "Do you know what's making them sick?" Nathaniel hesitated. He had always been honest with David, but he didn't want to burden him with the full weight of the crisis. "We're still trying to figure that out," he said gently. "But we think it might have something to do with the environment, the water, or the air. We just don't know yet." David looked thoughtful for a moment before speaking again. Is it like the time we talked about the plants at the nature reserve? How some plants can make people sick if they touch them. Nathaniel smiled faintly, remembering their many conversations during their hikes. Sort of. But this is more complicated than that. We have to look at everything. What the kids were exposed to, where they've been, what they've eaten or drank. David nodded, though Nathaniel could tell he didn't fully understand. But what mattered was that David was listening, that he cared. And in that moment, Nathaniel realized that this crisis wasn't just about solving a medical mystery. It was about protecting the future of the town, the future that David would inherit. As the investigation into the outbreak continued, tensions in Brookshire began to rise. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by fear and uncertainty. Some people began to pull their children out of school, while others pointed fingers, blaming the factories on the west side of town for the contamination. Protests erupted outside the local government offices, with residents demanding answers and action. Nathaniel, already stretched thin by his work at the hospital, found himself pulled into the center of the growing storm. As one of the most prominent voices in the community, he was called upon to address the public's concerns, to reassure them that steps were being taken to protect their children. But behind closed doors, he knew that they were running out of time. The turning point came one night when Nathaniel received a call from the hospital at 2 in the morning. Another child had been admitted, this time in critical condition. Nathaniel rushed to the hospital, his heart pounding as he made his way to the emergency room. Meredith was waiting for him just outside the pediatric ICU, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "It's bad, Nathaniel," she said quietly. "We've stabilized him for now, but he's not responding to treatment. If we don't find the source soon." Her voice trailed off, but Nathaniel didn't need her to finish. He knew what was at stake. They were running out of options, and out of time. Over the next 48 hours, Nathaniel barely left the hospital. He consulted with experts, pored over test results, and made endless phone calls, desperately trying to find a breakthrough. But every lead seemed to end in a dead end, and the number of sick children continued to rise. On the third day, just as Nathaniel was beginning to lose hope, a piece of the puzzle finally fell into place. One of the public health investigators, an environmental specialist named Dr. Tanya Rice, called Nathaniel with a new discovery. After conducting a thorough analysis of the water supply in the affected area, her team had found elevated levels of a dangerous chemical, likely the result of a leak from one of the nearby factories. "It's an industrial solvent," Dr. Rice explained over the phone. "It's used in the manufacturing process at one of the plants on the west side. It must have seeped into the groundwater, contaminating the water supply in that area." Nathaniel's heart raced. It all made sense now. The symptoms, the sudden outbreak, the concentration of cases in one part of town. They finally had an answer. "Can we fix it?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tight with urgency. "We're working on it," Dr. Rice replied. "We've already shut down the affected water sources, and we're sending out emergency notifications to the residents in that area. But we'll need to treat the contamination, and that could take some time." Nathaniel closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. They had found the source, but there was still so much work to do. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. With the source of the contamination identified, the hospital was able to adjust its treatment protocols, and the children who had been affected began to show signs of improvement. The factory responsible for the leak was shut down, and the local government launched an investigation into how the contamination had gone unnoticed for so long. But the crisis had left its mark on Brookshire. The town that had been slowly inching toward progress was now forced to confront not only its racial biases, but also its economic inequalities. The west side of town had been neglected for years, and this crisis had exposed the consequences of that neglect in the most devastating way. Nathaniel, who had been at the forefront of the push for change, found himself once again at the center of the conversation. He spoke at town hall meetings, advocating for stronger environmental regulations and increased investment in the west side. He called for accountability from the factory owners and demanded that the town's leadership take responsibility for the lives that had been put at risk. But amid the chaos, there were moments of hope. One afternoon, as Nathaniel walked through the hospital's pediatric ward, he passed by the room of the first child admitted during the outbreak. The boy, who had been critically ill just days before, was sitting up in bed, coloring in a book. His parents stood nearby, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. Nathaniel paused at the door, watching the family for a moment before continuing down the hall. It was moments like this that reminded him why he had become a doctor in the first place: to help people, to save lives, to be a force for good in the world. As he left the hospital that evening, Nathaniel couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. Brookshire had been through a lot in the past year, more than most small towns ever experienced. But through it all, they had come together. They had faced their demons, both seen and unseen, and they were stronger for it. When Nathaniel arrived home that night, David was waiting for him in the living room, a book open in his lap. He looked up as Nathaniel walked in, his face breaking into a smile. "Daddy, you're home." David jumped up from the couch and ran over to him, throwing his arms around his waist. Nathaniel hugged his son tightly, feeling the warmth of the embrace fill the empty spaces inside him. "I'm home," he said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." They sat down on the couch together, the quiet of the house a welcome contrast to the chaos of the hospital. David rested his head on Nathaniel's shoulder, and for a long time, they just sat there in silence, the weight of the world temporarily lifted from their shoulders. "Daddy?" David's voice was soft, hesitant. "Yeah, buddy. Do you think things are really getting better?" Nathaniel looked down at his son, his heart swelling with both pride and uncertainty. He wanted to tell David that everything was going to be perfect, that the world was finally changing in all the ways they had hoped. But he also knew that change was never simple, never linear. "I think they are," Nathaniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "But we still have a lot of work to do." David nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I want to help." Nathaniel smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "You already are, buddy. You already are." As the sun set outside their window, casting a warm glow over the quiet streets of Brookshire, Nathaniel allowed himself to believe that they were on the right path. It wouldn't be easy, and there would still be challenges to face. But they had come so far already, and with each step, they were building a better future, not just for David, but for every child in the town. And that, Nathaniel knew, was worth every sacrifice. Because real change, the kind of change that reshaped a community, a town, a future, wasn't just about big moments or grand speeches. It was about the quiet, unseen ripples that spread from every act of kindness, every stand against injustice, every decision to keep moving forward. It was about love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between father and son. And it was about hope, the hope that, no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel believed in that brighter tomorrow, not just for David, but for them all.